Yeah, you got to just keep whispering the secret down the line. And by the end of the line, it's a totally different sentence.
Right.
That made me never want to like check out the Bible anymore.
Yeah, the Bible was, it was an oral tradition for hundreds, if not 1,000 years before they ever wrote it down.
There have been so few good representatives of Christianity, and in particular of the intellectual component of the Christian faith, the historical component of the Christian faith. And in fact, there have been a lot of people spreading pseudoscience and sort of pseudo-history around the topic of the Bible, the formation of the Bible, and so on. And so I have to say for myself personally, it was very refreshing to have someone like Wes Huff come on and actually give a historic deep dive into the reliability of the Bible and the veracity of the message of Christianity from a historic sort of academic perspective. So in this video, we're going to feature one portion of this conversation where Wes brilliantly, chef's kiss, uses the power of a gift to explain an idea, an intellectual gift of the reliability of the Bible. Let's watch this clip. Then I'm going to show you guys a conversation that I recently had with Peter J. Williams on this very same topic of Cambridge University, where he is showing other examples of how the Bible actually told us about a character or a place, and the skeptical world said, no, that's not real, that's mythology, that's fiction. But then archaeology came along and gave us something that supported what the Bible previously said. Let's get into this.
We get that in history too, whereas we have these kind of what we think are established conventions, and then all of a sudden we discover something and it like completely overthrows the ideas that we have.
Like Clovis first.
Yeah, or Göbekli Tepe.
Yeah.
Or actually, good segue.
That's the best one, right?
So I made one. I made something for you.
Ooh.
So I make papyri facsimiles. Oh, my description is a little bit wonky here. Fix that. So you were talking about like what is our oldest manuscript evidence? So this guy is P52, John Ryland's 457. So that's a genuine Egyptian papyri that I made. I cut it out for you, and then I transcribed the text on that manuscript. So when we're talking about what is potentially our oldest evidence for the New Testament, this manuscript that most likely comes from Oxyrhynchus, Egypt, is the one that usually is universally accepted as our oldest one. And that contains John 18, where Jesus is on trial before Pilate. And yeah, so that's the one. It's in the John Rylands Library in Manchester, England.
So this is a copy of that exactly? This is exactly what it looks like?
Yeah, so I cut that out on the papyri with a scalpel, and then I transcribed the text on.
You did a great job, dude.
And
this is, you nerded out.
I know. I'm
for real nerded out. This is a real nerding out of.
So that's actually, yeah, so that's someone else's facsimile, which is not as good as the one I made.
It's not as good. Yours is better.
And where Jesus is on trial before Pilate, and Jesus says, everyone who follows the truth, who is following the truth, follows me. And on the back has the words of Pilate saying, what is truth? Wow. But so part of my research, so the reason I bring this up is because before this was discovered by C.H. Roberts in the 1940s, the convention was, because of a guy named C.H. Bauer, that the Gospel of John was 2nd century. And so he had this, he was a student of Hegel. Have you ever heard of Hegelian dialectic? So you have like a thesis, synthesis, and antithesis.
Yes.
So Hegel had this philosophical theory, and his student Bauer takes that and he incorporates this into history. And he says, the earliest gospel, Mark, has this very Jewish Jesus, and then the later gospels have a very the last of what are called the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Luke has a very kind of more divine Jesus. And so he says, based on this, John is the last written one. And it combines these two where you get a very human and a very divine Jesus together. And so based on this, he says that John has to be 2nd century. Well, we discover this guy. C.H. Roberts is, literally going through these piles of manuscripts in these drawers that are being like stashed away. And he finds this guy and he sees that it's written on both sides, which is almost exclusively a Christian convention. Because in the ancient world, they used scrolls. And the Christians, for reasons we're not entirely clear on, they start to make codices, books. And so they write on both sides. And so he says, okay, this is written on both sides. It's probably a Christian manuscript. So he sends it off to the leading paleographers, or guys who date manuscripts. And they all say, this is the beginning of the 2nd century. And so there's still debate about the dating of this, but the unanimous consensus is that it's comfortably second century, potentially the beginning of the second century, which means that this is found in Egypt. John is probably writing his gospel in Ephesus. So it has to be written by John, spread around, find its way to Egypt, be copied, and then end up in this manuscript. Wow. Which means that at minimum, you've already pushed the Gospel of John back into the first century comfortably, and potentially even most likely into the lifetime of the eyewitnesses of these events. And so all of the literature up until that point from the scholarly consensus about the dating of the Gospel of John gets totally rewritten.
This archaeological discovery supports what Christians have said for a long time, but it took some time for this to come out. There are a lot of other examples of this, by the way. I'm going to now show you guys a portion of a conversation that I recently had with Peter J. Williams of Cambridge University, where he's going to go through a number of other examples where the Bible first told us about a historical person or a historical place. The skeptical secular world said, no, that's not really real. There was not really any King David, for example. And then voila, archaeology discovers something that the Bible told us about first. That's a very odd thing for mythology to be doing. Here's Peter J. Williams. I'm going to let him take it away.
And this is a really key thing with the Bible. One really helpful exercise you can do is imagine yourself before archaeology. So archaeology sort of begins, you could say Thomas Jefferson begins it in the New World, Napoleon in the Old World, where people, let's say, early 19th century, start doing things systematically, digging out the ground. And that means you're in the 18th century, there is no archaeology. And then you read in the Bible, and it gives you a sort of story of God having these people, Israel, and they got different enemies. And at first it's the Amorites. Then after that it's the Philistines. In my language, I say Philistines, but there we are. And then after that, it's the Syrians or Arameans. Then it's the Assyrians. Then it's the Babylonians. Then it's the Persians. And the interesting thing is, archaeology comes along, and basically all of those people turn up in that order. And the Amorites are really big in the second millennium BC, like in the Old Testament, and they're not big after that. Likewise, Philistines turning up around the time of David. And not a lot, not so much after that. It just works. Or you find, people say with the Exodus, there's no direct evidence. No, of course, there's no Pharaoh that ever says they were defeated or anything like that. But just remember, we've only got 3 to 4 historiographical texts from all of ancient Egypt. So you've got loads and loads of writing, temples covered with spells and the glories of different kings. We do know that kings were very happy to erase each other. We know that's part of what they used to do to each other. They would damn each other's memory. That's why you can get pharaohs lost and, someone like Tutankhamun turn up again. But also, what we can say is what's stunning is you've got this Semitic grouping in the Eastern Delta in the middle of the second millennium BC, at about the time that you would expect that from the Old Testament. Now, I'm not saying that is exactly the same population, but it's just, that's a really interesting thing. Because in a sense, the Bible said something before archaeology began, and then, archaeology happens and that fits. Or you can look at the naming patterns. Names like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are really early names. And that's an interesting thing. They're early in the Bible, but also they're names that are showing up commonly in other cultures in the early part of the biblical period and not later. So there are those sorts of things. And I would say, because the Old Testament's longer, there's actually a massive data to analyze where you can say, again, I see it hard to falsify, to explain this as falsification. Even a country saying that they used to be slaves in another country. I mean, whoever does that and it's not true. I mean, that just no, it doesn't. That's unusual. There's no national literature that says as much negative about the people group from which it originates as the Old Testament does as Israel's national literature. You know that the books of Kings were not commissioned by the kings as royal propaganda. So whereas, you look at your Egyptian temples and, go down to Abu Simbel and Ramses II is telling you how great Ramses II is, you know that Ahab didn't commission the Book of Kings to tell you his glories. He doesn't come out that well in it. So all of these sort of things are interesting, and I think you can make a big case in the Old Testament. I mean, the other thing is, what literature are we comparing this with? So what we have with Mesopotamian literature, Babylonian, Assyrian, Sumerian, fairly short stuff. And it's not all joined up. What you have with Greek, the earlier stuff, that's trying to tell you a story, is something like Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey. And again, they're not giving you a whole history, they're just giving you a particular focused moment. Herodotus, slightly later in Greece, begins you with history telling, and his story begins, well, some men went and raided some women from over there, and that's not really giving you the comprehensive sweep of history that you get from Genesis through to Second Kings. So I'd want to say, just at the sort of literary level, the Old Testament is doing something bigger, grander than you will find in any ancient literature, and that's already should make you sit up. And then you look at how none of the protagonists are coming out particularly well, so it doesn't seem to be propaganda. That's all interesting. It's got incredible interconnection, and then starts connecting with the New Testament. So I think you start making a case for yes, it is part of the ancient world and its literature, but for it being really something different that humans should sit up and listen to.
Along similar lines, when I had the opportunity to go to the Holy Land with a prominent Jewish thought leader, and so because I was with him, they rolled out the red carpet for us, and we got a chance to go into the actual house of King David, and they showed us the little cellar where all the signet ring would have pressed the wax into the envelope where all the letters were sent out, and they, it was amazing. And they said, this is the vantage point where he would have been able to look down at the valley and across the way, where probably Bathsheba was one of those houses right over there, and just those details, physical archaeological details that come to light being in Jerusalem. I found that to be something where it was harder for me to my head around the idea that people think it's basically just all mythology, where it's like, I mean, even the Temple Mount there, we know that that's Solomon's temple. And I mean, there's like 1,000 things if you go to Jerusalem where there's a physical marker of a cited named biblical thing, event or location, etc.
Yeah, so I mean, a very clear case there is King David. King David, first known from the Bible, and then I think it's 1993 and 1995, inscriptions come out of the ground which are mentioning him, and that's a really interesting thing. It's called the Tel Dan inscription, and you can look that up. And since then, other ancient mentions outside the Bible of David have been found, and it's or identified. So I think it's a really interesting thing that yes, you first learnt about him from the Bible. Similarly, you could go to the Louvre in Paris, museum there, and you find all about King Mesha, who's mentioned in 2 Kings chapter 3, first known from the Bible. Then out of the ground in 1868 comes this monument put up by this king. So if it's fiction, it shouldn't be your first source of information. That it shouldn't be playing that role in culture, which it is regularly. So numbers vary, but at least 60 characters from the Bible, first known from the Bible, then found in archaeology.
That's huge. I did not know that. By the way, this whole podcast is coming out on Saturday. So if you guys like this portion of the conversation, if you guys like this topic of the reliability of the Bible and how it is historically supported and corroborated, then you'll definitely like that podcast.